October 23, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Major Hans Wegner of the Wehrmacht's 275th Infantry Division crouched in a concrete bunker 6 feet underground, listening to what sounded like the end of the world. American artillery had been firing continuously for 3 hours. The walls shook with each impact. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Outside, the forest that had stood for centuries was being systematically erased from existence. Wegner had fought on the Eastern Front. He had survived Stalingrad. He thought he understood what artillery could do to men and terrain. But this was different. The Americans were not conserving ammunition. They were not carefully rationing shells like every other army Wegner had encountered. They were firing as if their supply was infinite, as if every gun battery had access to unlimited munitions, as if the fundamental mathematics of war, the calculations of supply and scarcity that governed every military operation, simply did not apply to them. In his jacket pocket, Wegner carried a training manual from 1942. It explained German artillery doctrine with characteristic precision. Ammunition was a finite resource. Every shell represented steel, explosive, manufacturing capacity, and transportation. Efficient armies used artillery surgically, targeting specific objectives with calculated fire missions. Wasteful armies expended ammunition recklessly, achieving little beyond noise and smoke. The manual specifically cited American tactics in World War I as an example of inefficient firepower employment. The Americans, German doctrine suggested, did not understand the art of war. They substituted quantity for quality, throwing resources at problems rather than solving them with skill and intelligence. Major Wegner had believed this assessment. Every German officer had. It was fundamental to how the Wehrmacht understood itself as a professional force that achieved more with less, that compensated for material limitations with superior tactics and training. But as another salvo screamed overhead, as the bunker walls cracked and a soldier in the corner began sobbing uncontrollably, Wegner realized that German doctrine had missed something essential about the Americans. They were not wasteful. They were overwhelming. And there was a profound difference between those two concepts. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation of American artillery from a competent but conventional force into the most devastating fire support system in military history did not happen by accident. It emerged from a combination of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and a fundamental reimagining of what artillery was supposed to accomplish. Understanding how this occurred requires going back to the period between the wars, when American military theorists struggled to learn the right lessons from World War I. 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. American forces had participated in the final campaigns of World War I, with artillery tactics borrowed wholesale from French doctrine. The results were mixed. American guns fired millions of shells during the Meuse-Argonne campaign, but much of that ammunition detonated in empty trenches after German forces withdrew, or fell short, or overshot targets because fire control remained imprecise. After the war, German military analysts examining American performance concluded that US SAD forces relied excessively on material superiority while lacking tactical sophistication. This assessment was not entirely wrong. American artillery in 1918 had indeed substituted volume for precision, achieving objectives through sheer weight of fire rather than surgical accuracy. But the Germans made a critical error. They assumed this represented a permanent, American characteristic industrial wealth-masking tactical poverty. They failed to consider that American forces in 1918 were largely untrained, equipped with foreign weapons, and operating under borrowed doctrine. They did not anticipate that the United States would spend the interwar period systematically studying what had gone wrong and developing solutions that would transform artillery from a supporting arm into a weapon of unprecedented lethality. Between 1919 and 1941, American artillery doctrine underwent quiet but profound transformation at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Officers who had witnessed the chaos of World War I returned determined to solve fundamental problems that had plagued artillery since its invention. The primary challenge was time. From the moment an infantry commander requested fire support to the moment shells landed on target, an agonizing sequence of steps consumed precious minutes. Forward, observers had to identify targets and communicate coordinates. Fire direction centers had to calculate firing data, accounting for wind, temperature, air pressure, and shell trajectory. Gun crews had to receive orders, adjust their weapons, and load ammunition. Each step introduced delay and opportunity for error. In 1933, a team of officers at Fort Sill developed the Fire Direction Center concept. Instead of individual batteries calculating their own firing solutions independently, a centralized FDC would receive target information and coordinate multiple batteries simultaneously. This innovation allowed for massed fires, dozens or even hundreds of guns firing at the same target, with dramatically reduced response time. By 1939, the system had been refined to the point where American artillery could deliver time on target missions. Shells from multiple batteries, fired at different times from different locations, would all impact the target simultaneously. There was no warning whistle, no gradual build-up, just instant devastation that gave defenders no opportunity to take cover. The second major innovation involved forward observers. Traditional artillery relied on observers positioned at static observation posts, often miles behind the front lines. These observers had limited visibility and could not effectively direct fire in fluid combat situations where targets appeared and disappeared rapidly. American Doctrine instead embedded forward observers directly with infantry units, equipped them with portable radios, and trained them to move forward with advancing troops. This meant artillery could respond to threats as infantry encountered them, rather than firing predetermined missions at suspected enemy positions based on outdated intelligence. The third critical development was counter-B radar. In 1941, researchers at Bell Laboratories working under military contract developed the SCR-584 radar system, which could track incoming artillery shells in flight, calculate their trajectory backward using mathematical algorithms, and pinpoint the location of enemy guns with extraordinary precision. This technology transformed artillery duels from protracted exchanges into one-sided massacres. Traditional counter-B fire required observers to spot enemy muzzle flashes difficult in daylight, nearly impossible at night, or conduct time-consuming reconnaissance to locate enemy positions. The SCR-584 provided precise coordinates within seconds of detecting an enemy shell. American batteries could respond to enemy fire almost instantly, often destroying German guns before their crews could displace to new positions. None of these tactical and technological innovations would have mattered without the industrial capacity to produce ammunition in quantities that made German logisticians incredulous when they first encountered reliable intelligence about American production. Figures. Understanding American shell production requires examining an industrial mobilization unprecedented in both scale and efficiency. 1942, Radford Arsenal, Virginia. Construction began on what would become the largest ammunition manufacturing complex in the world, covering 40 square miles of Virginia countryside. At peak production in 1944, Radford employed more than 25,000 workers, operating around the clock in 3 8-hour shifts. The facility manufactured propellant using nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, loaded shells with TNT and other high explosives, assembled complex fuses, and prepared complete rounds for shipment. Similar massive facilities were constructed across the United States. The Milan Army Ammunition Plant in Tennessee, the Hawthorne Naval Ammunition Depot in Nevada, the Badger Army Ammunition Plant in Wisconsin, the Joliet Arsenal in Illinois, the Sangamon Ordnance Plant near Springfield. By 1943, American industry was producing artillery shells at a rate that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The numbers defy easy comprehension. In 1944 alone, American factories manufactured over 20 million artillery shells in calibers ranging from 75 mm to 240 mm, This represented more ammunition than Germany produced during the entire 6 years of war from 1939 through 1945. Each shell required precise manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch to ensure proper fit in gun barrels, explosive compounds mixed to exact specifications to guarantee reliable detonation, fuses calibrated to detonate at precise moments or altitudes. The scale and precision of this industrial effort remains one of the most remarkable achievements of World War II, yet it receives far less attention than aircraft production or shipbuilding because artillery shells lack the dramatic appeal of B-17 bombers or Iowa-class battleships. Transportation presented logistical challenges as formidable as production itself. An artillery shell weighs anywhere from 15 pounds for a 75mm round to 350 pounds for a 240mm shell. Moving millions of these munitions from American factories to European battlefields required a logistics infrastructure of staggering complexity. Shells travelled by rail from manufacturing plants to East Coast ports, where specialized stevedore crews loaded them onto Liberty ships and Victory ships. These cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyer escorts and hunter-killer groups, travelling through waters patrolled by German U-boats that targeted supply ships with the same intensity they pursued warships. They arrived at British ports like Southampton and Liverpool, or after June 1944, at French ports, including Cherbourg, Le Havre, and eventually Antwerp, when that crucial Belgian port was captured and cleared. From ports, shells moved by rail or truck convoy to forward ammunition dumps operated by ordnance companies, then to corps-level dumps, division dumps, and finally to battalion supply points, where gun crews collected their daily ammunition allocation. The sheer volume of this logistical flow staggers the imagination. During the campaign in northwest Europe from June 1944 through May 1945, American forces transported over 4 million tons of artillery ammunition across the Atlantic and through European supply lines. This required thousands of cargo ships making repeated voyages, tens of thousands of rail cars shuttling between ports and forward areas, and hundreds of thousands of truck trips along roads that were often under sporadic artillery fire or air attack. Every shell had to be tracked through a complex inventory system, stored safely away from combat zones but close enough to deliver rapidly, moved forward as armies advanced sometimes 50 miles in a day, and distributed to the correct units using the correct ammunition for their specific gun types. The administrative and physical labor involved in this logistics operation employed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilian workers, yet the system functioned with remarkable efficiency throughout the campaign despite the chaos of mobile warfare. The Germans never developed equivalent logistics capacity. Partly this reflected material limitations. Germany lacked America's steel production capacity, chemical industry infrastructure, and transportation networks that remained largely undamaged by enemy action. But it also reflected fundamental doctrinal assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong when tested against American methods. German military planning was built around the concept of quick, decisive campaigns, the Blitzkrieg doctrine that emphasized rapid penetration, encirclement, and destruction of enemy forces before they could organize effective resistance. Ammunition was stockpiled for initial offensives, with the optimistic expectation that captured enemy supplies would sustain subsequent operations. This approach worked brilliantly in Poland, where the campaign lasted 5 weeks, and in France, where organized resistance collapsed in 6 weeks and the Wehrmacht captured enormous quantities of French ammunition and supplies. It failed catastrophically in the Soviet Union, where the Wehrmacht found itself fighting a war of attrition for which it was neither equipped nor supplied, and where Soviet scorched earth tactics left little to capture. And it proved wholly inadequate against American logistics in Western Europe, where German forces faced an opponent that could sustain artillery fire indefinitely without any concern for ammunition conservation. By mid-1944, the contrast between American and German artillery logistics was stark, demoralizing for German soldiers who understood what they faced. A typical American artillery battalion received continuous resupply, with ammunition trucks making multiple runs daily from corps-level dumps to battalion positions. Ammunition availability was measured in units of fire, the the standard load for all guns in a unit to fire a sustained mission. American battalions routinely maintained 5 to 10 units of fire on hand at battalion level, with additional units available at division and corps dumps. This meant that a battalion could fire everything it had, and within hours have its ammunition stocks completely replenished. German artillery battalions received sporadic deliveries, often travelling only at night to avoid Allied air interdiction that made daylight movement suicidal, with ammunition strictly rationed to specific numbers of shells per gun per day. A German 105mm howitzer battery might receive 30 to 50 rounds per gun per day if supply lines were functioning. An equivalent American 105mm howitzer battery could fire 200 rounds per gun per day without any concern about ammunition shortage, and could request additional ammunition beyond the standard allocation if a major fire mission required it. This disparity created a fundamental psychological difference in how artillery was employed and how infantry viewed their artillery support. When American infantry encountered resistance and called for fire support, forward observers asked, "What is the target and where is it located?" The assumption built into this question was that ammunition was available in abundance, and the only question was where to direct it for maximum effect. When German infantry requested artillery support, gunners asked, "How important is this target, and does it justify expenditure of our limited ammunition?" The difference in these questions reveals the profound chasm between American and German artillery philosophy. Americans assumed ammunition abundance and asked only about targeting. Germans assumed ammunition scarcity and required justification for its use that weighed the value of the target against the cost of the shells expended. The campaign in Normandy demonstrated this disparity with brutal, unambiguous clarity that shattered German confidence. Beginning June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on 5 beaches along the Norman coast in the largest amphibious operation in history. German defenders, well entrenched in prepared positions and fighting with characteristic skill and determination, inflicted significant casualties during the initial assault phases. But as American forces pushed inland from the beaches, they brought their artillery with them in overwhelming numbers that German commanders had not anticipated. Within 2 weeks of D-Day, more than 300 American artillery battalions were operating in Normandy, representing over 3,000 individual guns of various calibers. These battalions were supported by logistics that delivered hundreds of thousands of shells daily through the Mulberry artificial harbours and directly across the invasion beaches, using specialized landing craft designed specifically for ammunition transport. At Saint-Lô in late July 1944, American forces prepared to break out from the Normandy hedgerows, where fighting had stalled for 6 frustrating weeks as German defenders used the ancient field boundaries as natural fortifications. The plan, designated Operation Cobra, called for concentrated artillery and aerial bombardment to completely shatter German defences in a narrow corridor west of Saint-Lô, followed by rapid armoured exploitation through the gap before German forces could recover and establish new defensive lines. On July 25th, the operation began with the most intensive bombardment yet seen in the European theatre. American artillery fired more than 140,000 shells in approximately 2 hours at German positions in the target zone. This preliminary bombardment was preceded by carpet bombing from over 1,500 heavy bombers, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives, followed by attacks from medium bombers and fighter bombers. Then the artillery resumed with even greater intensity. The bombardment continued in waves throughout the day, with brief pauses to allow bombers to attack, then resuming immediately. When American infantry and armour finally advanced late in the afternoon, they found German positions completely destroyed, survivors dazed and incapable of organised resistance, communications networks severed, and command structure collapsed. A captured German officer from Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's most elite armoured formations composed of training school instructors and demonstration troops, described the experience in his subsequent interrogation report. His words convey the psychological impact better than statistics alone could communicate. The bombardment was beyond anything we had experienced on any front, even in Russia where Soviet artillery was numerous and sometimes employed with great weight. The ground shook continuously like an earthquake. We could not stand upright. Trees, hundreds of years old, were uprooted and thrown like matchsticks. Vehicles weighing many tons were overturned by blast effects. Concrete bunkers collapsed. Men were buried alive in their foxholes and trenches, suffocated by displaced earth. After 2 hours of this, the division had ceased to exist as a fighting force in any meaningful sense. We had not been defeated in combat soldier against soldier. We had been erased from the battlefield by firepower we could not fight back against, could not survive, could not even comprehend the scale of. The breakout from Saint-Lô demonstrated what American artillery could achieve when employed without restriction or concern for ammunition expenditure. German forces that had held their positions tenaciously for 6 weeks disintegrated in a single day. Entire battalions surrendered en masse, not because soldiers lacked courage or training, but because continuing to fight had become psychologically impossible. Soldiers who survived the initial barrage emerged from their shelters to find their comrades dead or missing, their officers killed, their communications destroyed, their supply lines severed, and American infantry advancing behind a moving curtain of artillery fire that made any organized resistance suicidal. The concept of the rolling barrage artillery fire that advanced ahead of infantry at a predetermined rate had been used extensively in World War I with limited success. The timing was inflexible, coordinated by watches rather than by observed conditions, and infantry often had to wait for the barrage to lift completely before advancing, which gave defenders precious minutes to recover and man their weapons. American Doctrine refined this crude technique into the walking barrage, coordinated by radio communication between forward observers moving with infantry and fire direction centers, directing multiple batteries. As infantry moved forward against resistance, artillery fire shifted continuously, maintaining constant pressure on German positions without the rigid timing that had characterized World War I tactics. Forward observers could adjust fire in real time, bringing shells down on resistance points as they were encountered, rather than following preset schedules that bore no relation to actual battlefield conditions. German defenders found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation with no good options available. If they remained in their positions and attempted to fight, American artillery would eventually destroy them through sustained bombardment that could continue for hours or days. If they attempted to retreat to secondary positions, American forward observers in light aircraft, ubiquitous Piper L-4 Cubs, nicknamed grasshoppers, would spot the movement and direct fire onto withdrawal routes, catching soldiers in the open where they were most vulnerable to shell fragments. If they attempted to counterattack to regain lost positions or disrupt American advances, they would advance into preset killing zones, where American artillery had already calculated firing data and could deliver time-on-target fire missions within minutes. Every tactical option available to German commanders led inevitably to casualties. The only question was how many men would die before positions were abandoned. September through October 1944, the city of Aachen, Germany. This ancient city, the historical capital of Charlemagne's empire and site of coronations of Holy Roman Emperors, was the first major German city to face assault by American forces. Its defense became a crucial test of whether urban terrain could neutralize American artillery advantages. German commanders believed that fighting in a city would severely limit the effectiveness of artillery buildings, would provide substantial cover from shell fragments, narrow streets would make observation difficult, and Americans would hesitate to destroy civilian infrastructure and historical monuments of cultural significance. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong on every count. The siege of Aachen began on October 2nd and lasted 3 brutal weeks. American forces surrounded the city and issued an ultimatum demanding surrender to spare the civilian population and preserve historical structures. When German commander Oberst Gerhard Wilck refused, citing direct orders from Hitler to defend every German city to the last man and last bullet, American artillery began systematically demolishing Aachen block by block with methodical precision. Forward observers, positioned in tall buildings on the city's outskirts and in church steeples in captured districts, directed fire onto German strongpoints with devastating accuracy. Artillery battalions fired white phosphorus shells to mark targets with distinctive white smoke visible for miles, followed by volleys of high-explosive rounds to destroy the marked structures, then more white phosphorus to verify complete destruction and mark adjacent targets for the next fire mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When German forces attempted to reinforce threatened positions through underground passages, cellars, and the city's extensive sewer system, American engineers detected movement through seismic sensors and sound detection equipment, then called artillery strikes onto suspected tunnel entrances and exits. The result was that German forces found themselves trapped in positions they could neither reinforce nor evacuate, subjected to constant bombardment that methodically destroyed every building that might shelter defenders. The statistics from the siege of Aachen reveal the scale of American firepower commitment to a relatively small urban area. During the 3-week siege, U.S. artillery fired more than 500,000 shells into a city, measuring roughly 5 square miles. This represented 100,000 shells per square mile, or approximately 22 shells for every square meter of urban terrain. To put this in perspective, if shells had been distributed evenly across the city, every building, every street, every courtyard, every park would have been hit by dozens of shells. The ancient city centre, with its Gothic cathedral dating to the 8th century and medieval buildings that had stood for centuries, was reduced to rubble. The cathedral survived through combination of luck and perhaps deliberate targeting decisions, but most structures around it were completely destroyed. German defenders who survived described the experience as being trapped in an earthquake that never ended, where walls collapsed without warning, where the air filled with choking dust and smoke that made breathing difficult, where the constant detonations made verbal communication impossible, even by shouting directly into someone's ear. Oberst Wilck kept detailed notes during the siege that were recovered after his eventual surrender. His daily entries chronicle the systematic psychological disintegration of his garrison under relentless bombardment. October 7th. Artillery fire continuous since dawn. Men are holding assigned positions, but morale is deteriorating rapidly. Casualties mounting steadily. Have requested permission to withdraw to secondary defence line outside city limits where we can fight more effectively. October 10th. Permission to withdraw denied by higher command. Have endured 3 more days of this bombardment without respite. Estimate half my battalion is dead or wounded. The survivors are no longer effective soldiers, in any meaningful sense. They merely exist, waiting helplessly for the next shell to fall. Several men have gone completely mad and had to be restrained. October 13th. I can no longer maintain military discipline according to regulations. Men refuse orders to move between positions because any movement above ground draws immediate artillery fire. Some are crying openly, others sit motionless for hours, staring at walls, unresponsive to commands. The American artillery never stops, not even at night when soldiers desperately need rest. They must have infinite ammunition. Wilck surrendered on October 21st with approximately 800 survivors from a garrison that had numbered over 5,000 at the siege's start. When American officers interviewed him following his capture, he described the experience in terms that would become tragically common among German prisoners throughout the remaining months of the war. You did not fight us soldier to soldier, man to man, in combat that tests courage and skill. You destroyed the ground we stood on, the buildings we sheltered in, the streets we tried to move through. Everything was systematically obliterated until we had no choice but to surrender or die. This is not war as we understood it, as we were trained for at our military academies, as our doctrine manuals described. This is industrial execution on a massive scale, the application of overwhelming material resources to eliminate human resistance. The Germans were not wrong to characterize American tactics as industrial in nature. What they failed to understand was that industrialized warfare represented evolution and adaptation, not degeneracy or cowardice, as Nazi propaganda claimed. The Wehrmacht clung stubbornly to a romantic notion of combat as fundamentally a test of individual and collective skill. The better trained, more disciplined force should prevail regardless of material circumstances. This philosophy worked adequately when material disparities were modest and could be overcome through superior tactics, training, and aggressive leadership. It collapsed utterly when facing opponents who could produce and deliver ammunition faster than defenders could dig new positions, repair damaged fortifications, or rotate exhausted troops out of the line. November through December 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, where Major Wegner and the 275th Infantry Division were fighting desperately for survival against overwhelming firepower. This densely wooded area of approximately 50 square miles along the German-Belgian border became the site of one of the longest and bloodiest battles American forces fought in Europe. The forest's terrain seemed ideally suited to favor defenders' dense trees, provided cover from aerial observation. Broken and hilly ground concealed bunkers and fighting positions. Narrow roads were easily blocked and booby-trapped, and the thick vegetation limited visibility, to a few yards rather than miles. German forces believed confidently that the Hürtgen would be their Verdun, a place where American material advantages would count for nothing against determined, well-trained defenders fighting in ideal defensive terrain with intimate knowledge of the ground. They were partially correct in this assessment. The forest did significantly limit the effectiveness of American armor, which could barely move off the few roads without becoming hopelessly bogged down in mud or trapped between trees. Close air support was nearly impossible because pilots could not distinguish friendly from enemy forces beneath the dense canopy, and the risk of hitting American troops with bombs or rockets was unacceptably high. Artillery observation was difficult because forward observers could not see targets through the trees and vegetation. But the forest did not neutralize artillery itself. American forces, demonstrating the characteristic adaptability that marked their operations throughout the war, developed new techniques specifically optimized for forest fighting. Artillery shells fused for tree bursts, shells that exploded in the forest canopy 20 to 30 feet above ground rather than on impact with the earth, proved devastating against defenders in foxholes and trenches that protected them effectively from ground bursts. The physics were straightforward but brutal. When a shell exploded above ground, its fragments spread outward and downward in a cone pattern, reaching soldiers in positions that would have been protected from conventional ground bursts by the lip of their foxholes or the parapets of their trenches. The air bursts rained shrapnel downward through the trees, and the wooden fragments from shattered trees added to the deadly rain of metal. Soldiers who thought themselves safe in well-constructed positions found that the forest canopy provided no protection and in fact made things worse by adding wooden splinters to perch the metal fragments. Time on target missions coordinated multiple batteries to achieve complete surprise, with shells from different locations fired at carefully calculated times so they would all arrive simultaneously. There was no warning whistle of incoming shells building gradually. Instead, 1 second there was relative quiet, and the next second dozens or hundreds of shells exploded simultaneously, giving no time to take cover or prepare mentally for the impact. Counter-UAV radar identified German artillery positions within seconds of their firing and called immediate suppressive fire that forced German gunners to displace constantly or be destroyed in their positions. German artillery, once a source of pride and a weapon that could influence battles, became increasingly ineffective because crews spent more time moving to avoid counter-UAV fire than actually firing at American positions. The battle for the Hürtgen Forest lasted from September 1944 through February 1945, 5 months of continuous combat in conditions that tested the endurance of even veteran soldiers. During those 5 brutal months, American artillery fired more than 3 million shells into approximately 50 square miles of forest. That represents 60,000 shells per square mile, or approximately 13 shells for every square meter of terrain. To comprehend this scale of bombardment, Imagine standing on a plot of ground 3 feet by 3 feet, about the size needed for one person to stand, and knowing that statistically, one artillery shell landed on that exact spot during the battle. The forest itself became a victim of the bombardment as much as the soldiers fighting in it. Contemporary photographs taken after the battle show terrain completely transformed, no longer a forest in any recognizable sense, but rather a lunar landscape of overlapping craters. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps standing no higher than a man's waist. Those trunks that remained standing were stripped of bark and branches, transformed into shattered posts. Earth was churned into overlapping shell craters, filled with stagnant water and debris. Streams were dammed by fallen timber and displaced soil, creating swamps and bogs where clear water had once flowed. The natural drainage patterns were destroyed, turning the forest floor into a muddy morass that made movement difficult and miserable. German survivors described fighting in what had become an open-air mass grave, where bodies of dead soldiers were buried by shell impacts, only to be exhumed by subsequent explosions days or weeks later. The omnipresent smell of high explosive mixed sickeningly with decomposition and the acrid smoke of white phosphorus. Sleep became impossible because the bombardment continued day and night without pattern, pause, or mercy. Men learned to recognize different types of incoming shells by their sound: the shriek of 105mm rounds, the deeper roar of 155mm shells, the terrifying howl of the massive 240mm rounds that could obliterate a bunker with a single direct hit. Major Hans Wegner survived the Hürtgen Forest through a combination of luck, the protection of his well-constructed concrete bunker, and the fact that American infantry reached his position before a direct hit destroyed it. He was captured in late December when his position was overrun after a preparatory barrage that lasted 18 consecutive hours without interruption. When American soldiers entered the bunker cautiously, weapons raised and expecting resistance, they found Wegner and 3 surviving soldiers in a state approaching catatonia, unable to speak coherently, hands trembling uncontrollably, eyes unfocused and unresponsive to questions. The Americans, demonstrating the humanity that often characterized their treatment of prisoners despite propaganda that portrayed them as brutal, provided immediate medical care, water, and food. It took 2 full days before Wegner could communicate effectively enough for military intelligence officers to conduct a useful interrogation. In post-war interviews conducted in 1946 at a prisoner of war camp in Belgium, Wegner was asked by American historians to compare his experience fighting Americans in the West versus Soviets on the Eastern Front. His detailed answer revealed profound insights about the nature of American artillery dominance and why it proved so psychologically devastating even to soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front. Soviet artillery was extremely numerous and sometimes poorly directed due to inadequate fire control and observation systems. When Soviet barrages actually hit your position, the devastation was absolutely total nothing and no one survived. But Soviet fire was inconsistent and unpredictable in its effects. Sometimes they fired at wrong coordinates due to map errors or communication failures. Sometimes they simply ran out of ammunition in the middle of an attack because their logistics could not keep pace with their expenditure. You could survive Soviet artillery through a combination of luck, good fortifications, and by moving positions frequently, so they could not fix your location precisely. Wegner continued, American artillery was fundamentally different in character from anything else we experienced. It was precise beyond anything we had encountered. Shells landed where they were intended, adjusted by forward observers who seemed to be everywhere and could call fire within minutes. It was superbly coordinated between multiple batteries and supporting arms, creating barrages that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. And most importantly, it never stopped. The Americans could place shells exactly where they wanted them with remarkable accuracy, adjust fire based on direct observation by forward observers who moved with their infantry, and continue firing for hours or days because their ammunition supply appeared to be genuinely inexhaustible. They had developed a clear doctrine that we came to understand through bitter experience: why risk American soldiers' lives clearing a position when you can fire 500 or 1,000 shells and mathematically guarantee that nothing inside the target area survives? This was not wasteful, as our training manuals claimed. This was terrifyingly efficient. They were trading shells, which they had in abundance, for soldiers' lives, which they valued highly. They had far more shells than we had soldiers. This philosophy, the prioritization of ammunition expenditure over personnel casualties, represented a fundamental difference between American and German approaches to warfare that reflected deeper cultural and strategic differences. German doctrine emphasized economy of force, achieve objectives with minimal resource expenditure through superior tactics, training, and leadership. This approach made sense for a nation with limited resources, fighting on multiple fronts. American doctrine emphasized economy of lives, achieve objectives with minimal friendly casualties, regardless of resource expenditure. This approach made sense for a democracy where public support for the war depended on keeping casualties as low as possible, and where industrial capacity made ammunition abundance possible. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the clearest demonstration of how artillery dominance translated to strategic advantage. German forces launched their final major offensive in the West on December 16th, attacking through the Ardennes with 3 armies totaling over 400,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and carefully hoarded fuel and ammunition reserves. The offensive achieved initial surprise, breaking through thinly held American positions and creating a bulge in Allied lines that gave the battle its name. For the first 3 days, German forces advanced rapidly, overrunning American positions, capturing significant quantities of supplies, including desperately needed fuel and ammunition, and threatening the vital port of Antwerp, whose loss would have severely disrupted Allied logistics. Wehrmacht morale soared for the first time in months. Soldiers who had spent months retreating or holding defensive positions suddenly found themselves attacking again, liberating German territory, and demonstrating that the Wehrmacht remained capable of offensive operations that could change the strategic situation. Then American artillery arrived in force, and the situation changed completely. By December 21st, just 5 days after the offensive began, the U.S. Army had repositioned more than 250 artillery battalions, representing over 3,000 guns of various calibers, to contain the German penetration. This rapid redeployment was possible only because American logistics could move entire battalions with all their equipment hundreds of miles in just days, and because ammunition supply continued uninterrupted even during the crisis. Trucks carrying artillery ammunition received priority on roads, even over reinforcements and other supplies. On December 22nd, when winter weather cleared enough to allow air operations and air support resumed, American forces launched coordinated counter-offensives combining artillery, armor, tactical air support, and infantry in the combined arms warfare at which they excelled. The artillery campaign during the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated American fire support at its most sophisticated and devastating. Forward air controllers in liaison aircraft directed fire onto German columns, attempting to advance along narrow roads through the Ardennes, where vehicles were confined to roads by terrain and snow, making them vulnerable to precision fire. Time-on-target missions destroyed German assembly areas before attacks could be launched, catching troops in the open during the vulnerable moments when they were forming up for attacks. Counter-radar identified and suppressed German artillery within minutes of their firing, preventing effective supporting fire for German infantry attacks and making German gunners terrified to fire because they knew Counter-B would come almost immediately. Most devastating were the interdiction missions sustained bombardment of key roads, crossroads, and bridges that prevented German forces from receiving supplies, evacuating wounded, or retreating when positions became untenable. The German offensive depended on capturing American fuel supplies because Germany's own fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. American artillery made it impossible to move the captured fuel forward to where tanks needed it. German armor found itself immobilized not by lack of fuel in the theater, but by inability to transport that fuel through artillery fire. General George Patton's Third Army, repositioning from operations in the Saar region to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne, relied heavily on artillery to break through German defensive positions. On December 26th, as Patton's forces approached Bastogne from the south in a relief operation that became legendary. American artillery fired more than 150,000 shells in direct support of the breakthrough operation. The barrage began before dawn and continued for 6 hours, systematically destroying German strongpoints, command posts, and artillery positions. Every known German position was targeted. Every suspected German position was bombarded. The Germans had nowhere to hide and no way to fight back effectively. A captured German officer from the 5th Parachute Division later described the experience in his interrogation, and his words were recorded by American intelligence officers. "We expected an attack. We had prepared defensive positions. We had experienced American artillery before in earlier fighting, but nothing prepared us for the intensity of this barrage. For 6 hours, shells fell without pause. We could not move between positions because any movement drew immediate fire. We could not see through the smoke and dust that filled the air like fog. We could not communicate because telephone lines were cut instantly and radio operators were among the first casualties. When the barrage finally lifted and American tanks appeared through the smoke, we had no capacity to resist. Most of my men were bleeding from their ears and noses, completely deaf from the concussion. Many were in shock, unable to process orders. They surrendered immediately, grateful simply to survive. The Battle of the Bulge cost American forces approximately 80,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured during 6 weeks of intense winter combat. These casualties were painful and represented thousands of American families receiving devastating news. But German losses exceeded 100,000, and critically, Germany lost artillery pieces, ammunition, tanks, and fuel that could not be replaced at this stage of the war. American losses, while tragic for the soldiers and families affected, were replaceable within the industrial and demographic capacity of the United States. Factories continued producing ammunition on schedules completely unaffected by the battle. Replacement vehicles arrived weekly at European ports, on schedules that continued like clockwork. Reinforcements were trained at camps in the United States and shipped overseas in numbers that maintained unit strength despite combat losses. The industrial and demographic advantage that artillery dominance represented was not merely tactical, it was strategic, affecting Germany's ability to continue fighting at fundamental levels. By mid-January 1945, German forces had been pushed back to their starting positions. The Ardennes offensive had failed completely, and the Wehrmacht was significantly weaker than before the attack began. American artillery had played the decisive role, not through any single dramatic action that could be captured in dramatic photographs, but through sustained, systematic destruction that made German offensive operations unsustainable. Every German advance was met with artillery fire that destroyed attacking forces faster than they could be reinforced. Every German defensive position was subjected to bombardment until defenders were killed, wounded, or so psychologically damaged that organized resistance became impossible. The final months of the war saw American artillery employed with increasing efficiency as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself. Artillery supported every phase of operations. River crossings were covered by suppressive fire that prevented German defenders from concentrating forces at crossing sites. Any attempt to move troops toward bridges or ford sites drew immediate artillery fire. Urban combat was simplified by artillery that destroyed defensive positions before infantry had to assault them, reducing casualties among attacking forces. Isolated German units attempting to resist were subjected to prolonged bombardment until surrender became preferable to continued fighting. March through April 1945. The Ruhr Pocket. German Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model and numbering 325,000 soldiers, an entire army group trapped in an encirclement found itself surrounded by American forces. Rather than attempt costly assaults against fortified positions that would have resulted in heavy American casualties, American commanders established siege lines and employed artillery to destroy German positions systematically. The strategy was patient and methodical: contain the pocket, prevent breakout attempts, and use artillery to destroy German combat power until surrender became inevitable. Over 3 weeks, American guns fired more than 2 million shells into the pocket. The number is almost incomprehensible: 2 million shells into an area of approximately 4,000 square miles. German forces inside had limited ammunition because supply lines had been cut. They had limited fuel for vehicles because resupply was impossible. They had limited food because the pocket contained a large civilian population that also needed to be fed. They could not effectively return fire because every time German artillery fired, American counter-B radar located the guns and destroyed them within minutes. They could not break out of the encirclement because any concentration of forces for attack was detected and destroyed by artillery before the attack could develop. By mid-April, the pocket had collapsed completely. 317,000 German soldiers surrendered, the largest mass surrender of German forces in the West during World War II, larger than Stalingrad, representing the destruction of an entire army group. Among the prisoners was Field Marshal Model himself, one of Germany's most successful defensive commanders, who had earned his reputation stabilizing deteriorating situations on the Eastern Front through tactical skill, aggressive counterattacks, and efficient use of limited resources. Model had been Hitler's favorite general for defensive operations. The man called to crisis after crisis to restore situations that seemed hopeless. When interrogated by American officers after his capture, he was asked a simple question that cut to the heart of German helplessness. Why had he not attempted a breakout from the encirclement? His response encapsulated the strategic helplessness German commanders felt when facing American artillery superiority. To break out, Model explained, "We needed artillery support to suppress American positions along our planned attack route. Without artillery suppression, any attack would be suicide, infantry and armor. Advancing into prepared positions would be slaughtered. We had shells for perhaps 3 hours of sustained fire at most. 3 hours of artillery support for a breakout operation that would require sustained fire for days to succeed. The Americans could fire for 3 days, or 3 weeks, or 3 months without exhausting their ammunition supply. The mathematics of the situation made breakout impossible. Any concentration of forces for attack would be detected by their observation aircraft and destroyed by their artillery before the attack could develop. The encirclement was absolute not because of American infantry or armor, but because their artillery made any movement suicidal. Model's statement captures the essence of American artillery dominance better than any statistics could. It was not about individual battles or dramatic moments of heroism that could be celebrated in propaganda. It was about mathematical certainty, the absolute knowledge that American forces could sustain fire longer than German forces could endure it, could replace ammunition faster than Germans could dig new positions, could coordinate fires more effectively than Germans could disperse to avoid them. This certainty affected every tactical decision German commanders made in the war's final months. Positions that might have been held became untenable when subjected to sustained bombardment. Counterattacks that might have succeeded were cancelled when planners calculated that American artillery would destroy forming up areas before attacks could be launched. Withdrawals that might have been conducted in good order became routes when American artillery interdicted retreat routes. The industrial statistics behind American artillery operations in Europe remain staggering even when viewed from the perspective of modern warfare with precision-guided munitions and satellite surveillance. During 11 months of sustained combat, from June 1944 through May 1945, American artillery fired approximately 40 million shells of all calibers. This represented an average of more than 120,000 shells per day, every single day, for nearly a year. The weight of ammunition expended exceeded 4 million tons, equivalent to the cargo capacity of over 4,000 Liberty ships fully loaded. The monetary cost exceeded $10 billion in 1945 currency, which would represent over $150 billion in current value adjusted for inflation. Transportation of this ammunition required dedicated logistics infrastructure that operated with remarkable efficiency despite the immense challenges of moving supplies across an ocean and through combat zones where roads were often under fire. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces in France after the Normandy breakout, devoted approximately 40% of its total capacity to ammunition transport. Thousands of trucks loaded with artillery shells travelled in continuous convoys 24 hours a day from port facilities at Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Antwerp to forward ammunition dumps operated by ordnance companies. At these dumps, shells were sorted by caliber, fuse type, and propellant charge, then distributed to artillery battalions that sent their own trucks to collect daily ammunition allocations. The system maintained supply even during periods of rapid advance, when front lines moved 50 to 100 miles per week, and ammunition dumps had to be relocated constantly to remain within range of supported units. It maintained supply during the crisis of the Battle of the Bulge, when German attacks disrupted supply routes and forced hasty reorganization of logistics networks. It maintained supply during the Rhine crossing operations, when bridging equipment and assault forces competed with ammunition for limited bridge capacity. The reliability of American logistics became something German soldiers could count on as certainly as the sunrise American artillery would fire, and fire, and fire, because the ammunition would always be there. The human cost of this artillery dominance extended beyond military casualties to include psychological damage that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. German soldiers who survived sustained American artillery bombardment often suffered permanent psychological trauma. Post-war studies of Wehrmacht veterans found extraordinarily high rates of what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, with artillery exposure identified as the primary causative factor. Men who had functioned normally for years of combat became unable to tolerate loud noises after the war. They experienced uncontrollable trembling when they heard sounds resembling incoming shells. They suffered from nightmares that persisted for decades after the war ended. Nightmares of being buried alive, of being unable to escape while shells fell, of watching comrades die in ways too horrible to describe even years later. Major Hans Wegner, who survived both the Eastern Front and the Hürtgen Forest, lived until 1993. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, he admitted that he still could not attend fireworks displays or be near construction sites where blasting occurred. The sounds triggered panic attacks that transported him back to the Hürtgen Forest, back to the bunker where he had waited helplessly for death while American shells fell without end. "The physical wounds healed," he said. "The psychological wounds never did. Even now, 40 years later, I sometimes wake at night hearing shells that are not there, feeling the ground shake, tasting the dust and smoke. The Americans did not just defeat us militarily. They broke something inside us that could never be repaired." This was the true legacy of American artillery dominance in World War II. It was not merely that American forces killed enemy soldiers more efficiently, though they certainly did that. It was that they broke the will of enemy forces to continue fighting by making resistance psychologically unbearable. German soldiers in 1945 surrendered not because they were cowards, but because continuing to fight under sustained American artillery fire had become something human beings simply could not endure. The Wehrmacht training that emphasized courage, discipline, and duty had not prepared soldiers for the reality of industrial warfare conducted by a nation with effectively unlimited resources. The story of American artillery in World War II demonstrates that sometimes military superiority comes not from individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but from the systematic application of industrial capacity to the problems of warfare. The Americans had understood something fundamental that German doctrine had missed. In modern war between industrial nations, victory goes not necessarily to the most skilled or most courageous, but to those who can sustain operations longer than the enemy can resist. American artillery, backed by unmatched industrial production and logistics, could sustain fire indefinitely. German forces, no matter how skilled or brave, could not sustain resistance indefinitely against bombardment that never ended. Major Wegner's realization in the Hürtgen Forest that American artillery was not wasteful but overwhelming represented a fundamental truth about the nature of 20th century warfare. The Germans had been wrong in their assessment. The Americans were not substituting quantity for quality. They were employing quantity as its own quality, using overwhelming material superiority, not as a substitute for skill, but as a weapon more powerful than any amount of tactical cleverness could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.